secretary of the DNR, the highest ranking official, a political appointee. So it's no longer appointed by the Natural Resources Board. It's now a political appointee from the governor's office. Once the Office of the Public Intervenor was abolished, our MEA's founder, Melissa Scanlon, wanted to restore that resource that the citizens and the public in Wisconsin had in environmental issues, which is where she came up with the idea for Midwest Environmental Advocates. So we're not a government office. We're not affiliated with the government. We're an independent nonprofit. But our mission is to provide that legal and technical resource to the citizens of Wisconsin that previously existed within the Office of Public Intervenor. So I'm going to give a kind of brief overview of what I'm going to talk about in the presentation. First I'm going to just give a quick overview of some trends that we see both in the legislature as well as in the Department of Natural Resources itself as they relate to environmental issues. I'm going to talk about some of the impacts that's having and what we're seeing and what are some of the statewide issues that we're facing around Wisconsin. And then I'm going to talk about how we can all get involved, how citizens can get involved in these different issues, and then give a few examples of actions that people have taken and the impact that it's had. But just a couple of things to remember through the presentation. One thing we always like to say in our presentations is that environmentalism or environmental advocacy is not partisan. I mean, we're in a situation now where we have a government that's controlled by Republicans, and there's problems with the environment, and so there are efforts around the environment. But even when Democrats were in control, there was also problems that arose. And actually, the Democratic Governor Jim Doyle had campaigned on returning the Secretary of the DNR to an independent secretary, so making it no longer a political appointee. We actually vetoed that bill once it was put before him. So it's really both sides of the issue. And when you talk to people on the ground, there's Republicans, there's Democrats, there's independents. I mean, this clean water is not a partisan issue. And so I just want to reiterate that. We may be talking a lot today about what Republicans are doing currently, but it's not just Republicans. And then also, one of our board members just likes to remind us, I think it's an important thing to remember, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, there's ups and downs. We've been in downturns before and we've recovered. I think it feels disheartening to see a lot of the things that are going on, but I think there's hope that we can turn that around and make some progress. I guess the last piece I'll touch on here is that what was possibly most concerning to me is that the playbook that I've seen in my work has been instituted here in Wisconsin, both at the legislative level and specifically within the DNR. We're starting to see replicated at the federal level, and several of the officials, the administrators at DNR who instituted a lot of these policies that have been pretty harmful are now working within the EPA at the federal level. And so there's concern that kind of what we've seen over the last several years here is going to play out at the federal level. But it's kind of helpful, at the very least, to just know what's been going on. So at the legislative level, there's been a pretty significant onslaught of environmental bills lately. I think a lot of people have probably heard of these. At this point, it's getting too numerous to even keep track of. I mean, it seems like when the legislature's in session, it's every week there's something new that comes out. Some of the big ones this last session there was a repeal of our Prove It First metallic binding law. That was a law that said, you can do metallic binding in Wisconsin, but in order to do so, you have to show that it's been done without causing environmental pollution in at least one other place in the country, in the U.S. or Canada. The mining industry didn't like that law because they couldn't show that, and so that law was repealed this fall. Even more recently, there's these sort of like industry across the board exemptions, but what we're starting to see more often is these kind of company-specific exemptions from environmental laws. So big thing in the news lately has been Foxconn and the new industry company in Wisconsin, and there was several exemptions from environmental laws that were contained within the Foxconn bill. One of those was that for most major actions, or for all major actions that could have an impact on the environment that the state undertakes, the state is required to prepare an environmental assessment to kind of understand what the impacts of that action may have. The Foxconn project was exempted from that law, so they won't have to do that environmental assessment. And there was also, we're currently involved in we're representing the Ho-Chunk Nation in a permit challenge to a frac sand mining company's proposal to fill some rare and endangered wetlands. And the week before the hearing or the trial was supposed to take place, the assembly introduced a bill that would essentially moot the lawsuit. They said that they don't have to, that the company wouldn't have to comply with whatever the administrative law judge decided in the case. And that actually passed the assembly, but the Senate didn't take it up. It's possible they still could, but there's been a lot of people speaking out just about how unfair that process is. I mean, we have a process that we're supposed to follow, and citizens are, taking action and following that process, and they're trying to go through the legislature to get around it. So there's just been a lot happening at the legislative level, and it's picking up steam. I think it seems like the legislature is really kind of getting their feet under them and just knocking these bills out. So it takes a lot of awareness and a lot of keeping up and a lot of organizing to be able to keep up with all of it. Aside from the legislative level, my work focuses more, I don't do as much of the legislative work. My work focuses more with the DNR. What we've seen there is some really concerning trends. On the enforcement side of things, we've seen enforcement over the last, I think it's really, it started before the Walker administration. It was definitely in the Doyle administration where we've seen these trending of enforcement going down, where the agency's bringing less and less enforcement actions. They're referring less cases to the DOJ, and the DOJ is imposing less fines and other actions to penalize the polluters. Due to kind of several actions that citizens and other groups have taken, the legislature actually did order an audit of specific programs of the DNR, and the Legislative Audit Bureau, which is an independent state agency or independent state office, conducted an audit of the DNR's wastewater permitting program, and the results were extremely concerning. In certain types of enforcement, they found that the DNR was following their own policy in 4% of the situations. So 96% of the time they weren't following their policies. There's the wetland issue that I mentioned at the legislative level. What's going on there is that the professional staff of the DNR had recommended that this permit be denied, and then there was some political influence of the administration who directed staff to issue the permit, even though the staff felt like it didn't comply with state law. So there's this trend down in enforcement and compliance, and there's more and more reports, and what we're hearing from the staff is there's more and more instances of political influence in the process. So there's just a lot of concerning trends, but we'll get past the doom and gloom here in a second. And there's actually there's ways that citizens can participate and have an impact on these processes, and a lot of people are doing that work. So we'll get to that soon. But to just kind of a couple of statewide issues that we're involved with and that I'm familiar with, I just wanted to go over a couple of those things. I know it's kind of hard to see the text on these slides, but I'll kind of explain. And this slide really just kind of want to help people understand like how a change in state law can have such a broad impact across the state. In 2004, there was a law passed that it's referred to as the Livestock Facility Siting Law, and it took away local power over making the decision about where CAFOs or large industrial agricultural facilities can be located within their own communities. And it really kind of put that power in the state. And since that time, we've just seen an exponential growth in these large industrial agricultural facilities across Wisconsin. The map shows currently, I think it's as of 2016, where the different industrial agricultural facilities are across the state. Up in the northeast corner around here, you can see there's a high concentration of these large agricultural facilities, and I'll talk in a second about, well, I'll talk right now about the impact that that's having. So, excuse me, the Kewaunee County, I think, has the highest concentration of these industrial agricultural facilities in the state, and they also have this type of they have karst geology, which is where the soil is very thin, and there's direct conduits to groundwater from the surface. So if manure or other water runs over that field with a karst fissure, that water will go directly into groundwater and won't be filtered by the soil. There's lots of that type of geology in Kewaunee County, and it's also the highest concentration in the state of these big facilities that have to spread their manure. And so what's been happening is, unsurprisingly, a lot of people who rely on groundwater, their wells are being contaminated with different pollutants. There's a speaker later today that is speaking with Elizabeth, Mark Borkart. He's a microbiologist with the USDA, and he's done a lot of groundwater testing in Kewaunee County. Originally, when they did the testing, I think they found that it was either 30 or 40% of the wells that they've tested are contaminated with bacteria or nitrates or both. And then some more recent testing has found even higher levels. I think it's 60% or something along those lines. But there's a real kind of crisis in that county where there's just not clean drinking water for a lot of families. And it's there's more and more evidence to suggest that that's a direct impact from the agricultural practices that are happening in the county. Another big issue in Wisconsin.
Jim, before you leave that, there's also the issue of high cumulative impact of high capacity wells.
Yeah.
And the Attorney General overruled the district judge's decision on it. Are you involved in that? Is MEA involved in that?
So we are not directly involved. So the issue is that another big impact from agriculture is high capacity wells, water usage as opposed to kind of water quality. And they take a lot of water to do their practices. And based on some Supreme Court precedent and state law, the state used to consider the cumulative impacts of the of these wells on the environment. So if there was a proposal to put a new well in an area, they would look at the impact of that well in addition to all the other existing wells and determine what the impacts to local rivers or lakes or other water sources might be. And as he was suggesting, or as he stated, the Attorney General issued an opinion saying that the DNR doesn't have the authority to consider the cumulative impacts of wells. And so when you're deciding whether or not to approve a well, you can only look at the impact of that particular well. And obviously it's not a very science-based decision or science-based way to make a decision about the impacts on the environment.
That's being challenged, right?
It is being challenged. So Clean Wisconsin is challenging a group of permits that were issued under that new sort of framework. And the circuit court, so the kind of first level of review, found that the DNR has the authority to consider cumulative impacts and has to. And I believe that's being appealed. I can't remember.
I think so.
Yeah. So, And there's lots of groups involved with that. MEA submitted a brief in the case on behalf of several other organizations who are concerned. So there's a big community working together on trying to get that.
Yeah, we're part of that group, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I'm covering a couple of issues just to give you an overview, but there's a lot going on. Another big issue, and this is one that I work on a lot, is phosphorus pollution, and the impact of that is that these algae blooms, a vast number of waters across Wisconsin are polluted with excess levels of phosphorus. A big contributor is industrial municipal wastewater, but also a big contributor is agriculture. The state has made some progress. We're one of the first states in the country to adopt water quality standards for phosphorus, or numeric water quality standards. The only other state to do it is Florida, and the state didn't actually do it, the EPA did it. But here in the state, we passed these water quality standards. And so that was a big, kind of, big moment in trying to address this problem. But since then, that was in 2010, there's been several attempts to get rid of the rules, defund implementation of the rules, provide more flexibility to the polluters. There's just been kind of every year or two, there's a new effort to try to reduce the impact of the rules. And that's been from the governor's office, the legislature, and the DNR itself. And so there's just been a lot of efforts on the environmental community to try and protect those rules. Another big industry here in Wisconsin that's been popping up is frac sand mining. There's just so much to talk about here, but just to kind of give people a sense that, when I first started working at MEA in 2011, there's very few of these industrial-sized sand mining operations in Wisconsin. We're talking like 6 or 7, maybe 10. And now I think there's over 130 either mining or processing sites or rail loadout facilities. So it's really been an explosion in this industry. And the state has been very, very reticent to impose any type of regulations or any new regulations on this industry. So we have an existing regulatory framework, but that framework was designed for the smaller sand and gravel quarries, and it hasn't been updated to address this sort of new and much larger industry. And there's lots of, for those of you that live in the parts of the state that have these frac sand mines, there's lots of impacts. Environmental, social, economic. I mean, it spans the gamut. But there hasn't been any movement at the DNR, and the state legislature has been trying to take away local control because local communities have actually been making some progress in addressing the impacts. And the companies don't like that, so they go to the state legislature and they try to get laws passed that undo what the local communities have done. There's been some great efforts from citizens to prevent some of those laws from actually being passed, but it kind of, every session it gets introduced, they get really close, and it's a little scary, but luckily for the most part, folks have been able to kind of keep those bills from being passed. This is the last one I'll talk about. There's a report from the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, which is a great resource for information. They did like a 7-part series, I think it was a 7-part series called Failure at the Faucet, and they were talking about drinking water in Wisconsin. One of the things that they found is that over 94,000 households in Wisconsin that are on private wells have unsafe or may have unsafe levels of nitrates in their water. And it's a big problem. The darker areas are where those unsafe wells are, so you can see kind of the part of the state that it affects most. And there's not a lot, as far as I know, there's not a lot being done to address this. We have these groundwater standards, but There's not a lot being done to protect people. There's no surface water standards for the levels of nitrates. It's an issue that I think is becoming more known among more people, and people are starting to kind of wake up to this and trying to figure out how to address it. But there's just, as far as I've seen, there's not a lot of movement or progress on addressing this problem.
What's the cause of that?
A big cause is agriculture, and but beyond that, I'm sure there are other causes. I'm not sure. I don't personally know a ton about the causes.
There's a breakout session at 1 o'clock to talk specifically about that.
There you go. That'd be a great place. Thanks. Okay, so that's the end of the doom and gloom portion of the presentation. It felt like a long time. So I'm just going to introduce these. We're already at half an hour. I do want to leave time for discussion if there's any. But I want to introduce a couple of ways that people can get involved. And I think some of these things I'm sure people know about, but I just want to cover the gamut because there are a lot of ways to be involved. And I introduced this one first, the Open Records Law, because I think it's really a really important tool. It's a really essential tool that people need to know about in order to effectively participate in these government decisions. And so the Open Records Law allows anyone to request any government documents, any documents held by the government, and it requires the government to turn those documents over. There are limited exceptions, but they're very narrow. And the law itself requires agencies to interpret those exceptions very, very narrowly. And whenever it's not a clear-cut case, the law requires the agency to err on the side of public interest of disclosing the records. So these can be a really powerful tool because it covers emails, calendars, notes, any kind of documents. If a company turns over documents to the agency has to give those over. You don't have to identify yourself. There's no specific way you have to make the request. You can ask for them in person, over the phone. We recommend that you do it in writing. Easiest way is through email, because if the agency doesn't turn the documents over, you can sue them, or you can ask the Attorney General or a district attorney to sue them. And it's helpful to have a written record at that point. So an important thing to do is to make sure your request is in writing. And one thing to kind of keep in mind is you can be charged for the time that it takes the agency to search for the records. So if you submit a request saying you want all the agency's records relating to nitrates for the last 10 years, I mean, they have to turn them over to you, but they might tell you it's going to cost us $6,000 for us to, in staff time, to pull all that together. So it's important to kind of narrowly tailor your request to ask for the information that you want.
My understanding is that you can ask to have that transmitted to you electronically so that they are prohibited from charging you inflated printing costs.
That's correct, yeah. So in addition to the charging you for the search time, I can also charge you reasonable fees for the copies. So most agencies, I think, charge either 20 or 25 cents per page for the copies. So if you're getting 100 documents, I mean, it starts to add 100 pages of documents, it starts to add up. But you can ask for them to just transmit them electronically, which means you won't be charged the copying cost, but you still could be charged the time for the staff time it takes to gather your request. In a lot of cases, if you're just asking for a few documents or for a small number of documents, there may be no charge. But it's just important to keep in mind you don't want to ask for too much or more than you really need or are interested in, so you don't get those big charges. And there shouldn't be a surprise. The agency should reach out to you before they process your request to say, this is how much we expect the cost to be, so then you can make a decision about whether they should move forward. You shouldn't get a surprise at the end and be on the hook for it. So again, I bring that one up first because it's a critical way to kind of understand what's happening at the state level. A couple of other things I want to address are how, at the state level, kind of how citizens can get involved in both the permitting process, the enforcement process, and there's lots of other tools that you can use as well. So one of the really kind of amazing things about our environmental laws in this country is the amount of rights that it gives to the public to be involved in the process. So when our major federal environmental laws were being passed in the 1960s and early 70s, these were sort of the first types of these laws in the world. You know, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. I mean, there wasn't really a framework for these types of laws anywhere else. And one of the things that Congress recognized at the time was that there's an essential role for the public in the process of permitting and enforcement in these environmental laws. And so they enshrine these opportunities to participate in these federal laws, which are then carried down to the state level. For most environmental laws require agencies to allow public comment on their permitting decisions. They require the states to give citizens an opportunity to challenge those permits in administrative and judicial proceedings. And the most unique part, I think, to our environmental laws is that they require states to allow citizens to actually enforce the laws. And so I think the interesting way to kind of think about it is they allow people to act as private attorney generals. So for most laws, if someone's breaking the law, it's up to the state to take that enforcement action. You know, citizens can't go and enforce lots of different laws. But in the environmental context, if someone's breaking the law and the state isn't taking action to enforce the law, then citizens can actually file a lawsuit against the polluter for their violations. So these are really powerful tools. The citizen who brings the suit doesn't recover anything themselves. They don't, whatever fines the court may impose don't go to that citizen. They go to the state, and they go to pay for the cleanup of whatever pollution there was. Although you can, if you're successful, you can recover attorney's fees. So a lot of these cases require having an attorney, and if you're successful, your attorneys can recover their fees from the other side. But this is like an incredibly powerful tool, and it's been used effectively in a lot of states, and is a big deterrent to polluters all across the country. And it's especially useful when you have an agency in a state that's not taking enforcement action, because that's one of the criteria. You can't bring these cases in a particular instance if the state is actually doing a good job of enforcement. It's where you're sort of secondary to the state. It's where they fail to take action, citizens can step in. The other thing I want to mention is beyond those two, like permitting and enforcement, the environmental laws are sort of riddled with provisions that give different opportunities for citizens to be involved in the process. And so I list several here. They're typically referred to as petitions. So there's like petitions for rulemaking, where you're asking the agency to do rulemaking. There's petitions to object, where that's coming out of the Clean Air Act, where you're asking the EPA to object to a state permit. There's, in some cases, it's really just kind of a petition. You're asking the agency to do something. The agency doesn't have to do it or doesn't even have to respond. But in some cases, there's very strict rules that require the agency to respond and that require the agency to take action if you demonstrate that whatever you're asking for is warranted. So, like the petition to object, we currently have a couple of those pending before the EPA. And if our petition has demonstrated that these permits have violated the Clean Air Act, the EPA is required by law to object to these permits. So there are these tools throughout these environmental laws that people can use, and it's important to kind of keep that in mind, because they can be powerful, and a lot of them take a long time to play out, but it is a way that that people have been able to affect change over time. And at the local level too, I think that's where a lot, especially in the frac sand mining context that I've seen, that's where a lot of action happens. There's a lot of local decisions that have to be made related to a lot of industrial or other types of activities. It's usually easier to have for citizens to have an influence over their local boards than it is at the state level. So you can really have an impact at that local level, and communities around Wisconsin have, which is why you see laws like the Livestock siting rule and the efforts around frac sand mining to remove local authority. Because it's a place where you can have some really strong impact. So it's not an area to neglect as you're thinking about your own efforts and issues that you're working on. It's easy to kind of talk about all these other tools, all these tools that are available. I'm sure most people are like, well, how do I find out about all this? It's important to look at the relevant statutes and regulations, which it can be a bear to get through. But that's where all of these different rights are going to be enshrined and where you're going to find them. So this is just an example. It's for wastewater permits. It's the provision that allows 5 or more persons to challenge a permit. Throughout the environmental laws, there's just provisions like this that allow for that, for citizen participation in the process. There are lots of resources online from advocacy groups and from other organizations that explain these different processes. And for folks in Wisconsin, MEA is a resource for people who are working on issues. You're welcome to call us. We have an intake line where we commonly get questions about, I'm facing this issue, how do I get involved, what are my options? In some instances, we'll take on representation, but in most cases, what we end up doing is trying to help people identify these areas where they might be able to participate, help them understand that process, and kind of hopefully give them a little guidance on how to be effective in that process. It's a lot to kind of get through on your own, but there are resources out there for folks. And there's, beyond MEA, there's lots of other organizations around Wisconsin who are familiar with a lot of these tools that you can call and get some information from. So another tool that I think is really important is, especially in a time like now where you have a government that's really on the attack, is public perception. And so the things that that citizens have been able to have been successful on, a lot of times one of the key components is public awareness around that issue. So a lot of the stuff that the legislature is trying to do is, they're passing some bill at midnight, or they're trying to ram something through really quickly. And what's been able to stop that is public awareness and getting media attention to the issue. I think that folks sending letters to editors and op-eds are really important to bring awareness to issues. So if you're facing some issue in your community, it's important to get that message out to others, because the more people working on these issues and the light that you shine on these issues, the harder it is for them to be able to do what they're trying to do. And this is just another example of kind of spreading your message throughout your community. This is a group called Kiwanee Cares. They purchased some space to put billboards up, just again trying to educate your community, bring awareness. So there's different ways you can do it. They can frac sand. In the frac sand area, there's been billboard and yard sign efforts that have really brought awareness to issues. So get creative, think about how to do it, but it's important to shed light and bring awareness to whatever issue you're working on. It's going to make it a lot easier. So given the time, I have several examples of some actions that citizens have taken and the impact, where they've been able to have a positive impact. Kind of wanted to leave it on a higher note. I don't know that I have time to go through all of them, so I think, well, I'll talk about this. So the Safe Drinking Water Act petition. This is where there's a Safe Drinking Water Act. It's a federal law that regulates drinking water across the country, sets different standards, but it also includes a provision that allows citizens to petition the EPA to take emergency action where there's some sort of drinking water crisis happening in an area. And so I mentioned earlier about all the wells being polluted in Kewaunee County. And so in response, because the state agency wasn't doing anything about it, several organizations petitioned the EPA to use their emergency power to take action in Kewaunee County and do whatever was necessary to provide clean water and to fix the problem. It's not a silver bullet, like we didn't get everything that we wanted, but a lot of good has come out of that process. EPA has really put a lot of pressure on the state to begin taking action. The state did start providing clean water to the affected community, give access to clean water, and they also began a process for promulgating new rules that address agricultural runoff. And so it's not nearly as much as I think folks had hoped, but it is a step in the right direction where we do, and we will have rules that start to address some of the major impacts in that area of industrial or of manure spreading, which is causing that contamination. Let's see if there's one other. So this is what you were talking about, the high cap well permits. And this is, the Mazomanie tribe has filed a legal challenge to a mine that's being proposed in Michigan, but it's going to have impacts in Wisconsin and on the Mazomanie River. Just again, another example of using those legal processes to actually have an impact and to affect change. And there was a bill in the legislature in 2016 that was being passed through trying to be passed through pretty quickly to a certain extent privatize water systems and at least allow for privatization of water systems in the state. But again, that effort was making its way through the legislature, no roadblocks, public caught wind of it. A lot of people started organizing around it, and that effort was stalled and was never passed in the legislature. So again, getting that awareness, that public attention, and the media to start writing on this can really have an important impact on these efforts. This is an action where we're representing 16 citizens across Wisconsin. We petitioned the EPA to require the DNR to fix its wastewater permitting system. It's been 2.5 years, and we've seen progress, but it takes a long time to play out. But it has resulted in some new rules for the DNR and how they're doing the wastewater permitting. So it has had an impact. I'm going to stop, but this is just the last couple pictures are just some examples of some community efforts and some citizen efforts around Wisconsin. This is Wisconsin's Green Fire. It's a group of retired DNR professionals who have, obviously left the agency but are really concerned about what's happening. So they've come together to kind of be the voice of the DNR and be the voice of science. And it's a new group. They just formed in 2017, but they already have, I think, over 300 members at this point. There's the Sustained Rural Wisconsin Network, which is a network of, I think, at least 18 communities across the state who are working together to address these industrial ag impacts. The idea, I think, I shouldn't speak for them, but my understanding of the idea is we learn a lot in our own communities about how to address different impacts, and it's really kind of pulling together that information and sharing stories and sharing an understanding of the process across the state as opposed to keeping it within particular communities. And the last one, the Citizen Water Coalition of Wisconsin. This is a picture of their lobby day, water lobby day at the Capitol, and it was all volunteer organized. It wasn't organized by any, state group or anything like that. It was people who care about water coming to the legislature and talking to their legislators about water issues. All right, so I did not leave much time for discussion. I apologize, it can be long-winded, but we have about 12, 13 minutes if anyone has any questions or any issues that they want to discuss or anything along those lines. Be happy to
Jim, I think you should point out that when public citizens get involved in litigation against like the DNR, because we've been involved 3 times, including Perrier with Melissa Scanlon and Ed Garvey. But the thing is, it's very expensive. You've got to be willing. We had to mortgage our farm to follow on some of these suits. So it's not something that you just jump into.
Yeah.
It's a responsibility, and fiscally, it's a personal responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I appreciate that you bring that up. It is expensive. There's ways to really kind of share that burden and share the resources, but it doesn't completely make up for that. I can tell you from my firm's standpoint, we typically provide representation either pro bono or at a very reduced rate, and we'll have a cap on fees. So in the time that I've worked for MEA, I don't believe, which is 6 years, so it's not going back to when you were involved with us. But our mission is to be able to provide legal representation regardless of the person's ability to pay. So we get funding from foundations, from private donors across Wisconsin that help fund those efforts. So the cost is still there, but through organizations like MEA, we're able to spread it around to a wider group of folks. But in addition to costs, I think it's difficult for people to stand up in their community for lots of reasons and kind of take some of these actions on. There's folks who are really concerned about the impact of some of these farms in Kewaunee County, but when we talk with them about whether they want to take action, they're fearful of retribution from their neighbors, or they work for somebody that's associated with the farm and they're concerned about their job. There are these tools, but there's a lot of considerations you have to take beyond just is there an option, and you have to kind of weigh the different considerations that come into play. That's certainly something that when you call MEA, and if you talk to me, that's the kind of thing that we'll talk through and we'll try to make sure that you're aware of. And because we've heard from former clients and folks kind of what those considerations that are important are, and we try to make sure a person's fully informed before they take on something. Anything else from anybody?
Are you doing anything about pipelines?
We are. There's a session later on the pipelines with Elizabeth here in the back. Our involvement's been fairly limited. We try to provide some legal research or other kind of legal assistance to the extent that we can, but we haven't been nearly as active as groups like Sierra Club and 350 Madison. There's a lot of groups that are working on that. We try to be a partner, but...
So you're water and but I would ask another question. With Foxconn, it's going to be using so much water, and isn't there a Great Lakes Compact?
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem possible. How many million gallons are they taking a day?
8.
Is that 8?
8 per day.
8 million gallons? And then they're supposed to fix it up all right and send it back down.
Not all of it.
Not
all of it is going to be reusable.
And then there's the Foxconn wants to go to Michigan, so you got on the other,
Yeah, well, that's the issue that I personally have been working on. So MEA is a part of the Compact Implementation Coalition, which is a group of Wisconsin organizations that are working to ensure that the Great Lakes Compact is strictly adhered to. And for those of you that don't know, the Great Lakes Compact is an international agreement between the 8 states in the Great Lakes Basin and 2 Canadian provinces that says we're not going to allow Great Lakes water to be diverted out of the basin. So it prohibits anyone from diverting water. There's 2 small exceptions. The small exceptions are for communities that straddle the basin line, and then for a community that's within a county that straddles the basin line. And in each of those situations, in certain circumstances, there's a way that those communities can get that water. The sort of history behind it is there was proposals being floated. The governor of New Mexico, which is my home state, during a campaign was talking about trying to build a pipeline to New Mexico from Lake Michigan.
Exactly.
There was proposals, there was some talk, I don't know how serious, about taking water, fresh water to China from the Great Lakes. So that was the kind of context behind what led to the compact. And in the case of Foxconn, it's going to be located in the village of Mount Pleasant, which is a community that straddles the basin line. So it's partly on the basin, partly out of the basin. But what they need to show is, under the compact's terms, is that the water that's going to be transferred out of the basin is going to be used for public water supplies purposes. And what that means is that how that's defined in the compact is a group of largely residential customers. But under the proposal, there's primarily one customer, which is an industrial customer of Foxconn. So we've submitted comments to the DNR asking them to deny the permit. And depending on the DNR's decision, there is an opportunity for interested citizens or impacted citizens or groups to challenge an approval if it gets to that point. So there could potentially be a lawsuit over that.
But other states want to say too? I mean, they have
so in this situation, if it were a community that's outside the basin, but within a county that straddles the basin line, it would have to be approved by all 8 Great Lakes states. But in this situation, it only has to be approved by the state of Wisconsin. There's a couple of things that could trigger additional review, but they're not. Like if they were going to consume, so not return 5 million gallons or more per day, then they would need to get approval from the other states. But their proposal is to consume, I think, like 2.8 or 3. So it doesn't quite, it doesn't trigger the additional review in this situation.
So how do you know when there's, if there is a lawsuit, how do you know how to get involved in that? Because this, this is just opening up. I mean, Cape Town in South Africa is almost out of water. Water is going to become more valuable than gas.
Yeah.
And it's not in that far future.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with you. I think the way I personally would go about trying to figure out who's working on the issue, what kind of organizations, and I personally use the internet. I would Google Great Lakes Compact, Foxconn, and you'll see some press releases from organizations. You can call us and say, I'm concerned about this. Do you know of anyone that's working on it? That's really starting. You got to make those connections with people, because there are people working on all these issues. You just got to, whether it be using the internet or just phone calls or emails, just start reaching out. And most people, if they're not working on it, they're happy to put you in touch with a group that may be. And so it's networking, I think, really.
What's your number?
Is it the DNR who's making the decision?
It is, yeah. So it's it's not good.
Yeah.
Our number is
Check.
not up there. 608-251-5047.
There is a Great Lakes Compact Coalition, which is like a coalition of groups working on it, and I think it's like greatlakescompact.org, but if you Google it, it'll come up. That kind of lays out everybody involved.
Yeah.
Okay.
But for any issue you're working on is, just finding those people who have similar interests and who are working on the issue. There's people out there that are just making those connections.